Welcome to Doc's Lab and our second Master Series. Welcome to Doc's Lab and our second Master Series. I do believe this is the 101st video in our second Master Series, the 48th or 49th video in our basic process, or 50th video in our basic processors, the 13th video on our sculpting processors, and the third video on noise, and this is the second video on automation. So what we're doing is we're just picking up where we left off from the last video. So let's go ahead and get back to it. Okay, so now we want to listen to some noise onto a file. So I have this file that I showed you that was cleaned and EQ'd a little bit, and I put a little bit of reverberation on it so it wasn't completely dry, so it was a little bit wet. So basically what we're going to do, we have a couple different applications. The first application is we're going to take and, well, if you'll excuse me really quick, I will put this one and this one off because we don't need to look at those ones. And we have one that's an analog emulation file that is pink and white noise. And we have one that is a sculpting file that is brown, gray, blue mixed for doing sculpting on it. And then I've got two other files that basically what I've done on these two files is I was planning on the first thing adding analog emulation, a little bit of sound sculpting, and then on the second one I wanted to do analog emulation and sound sculpting a little bit more detailed. I mean, I'd have this violet blue noise in the upper end and this same brown, gray, and blue mix file in the lower end. If you look at my EQs on those two channels or those two tracks, I've got the lower brown noise EQ'd to this area, and I have this blue noise that's a mix is just in the upper area. So basically what we're going to do is I'm going to close this, and what we're going to do is I'm going to play this track for me. Turn down the microphone so you can't hear my microphone and my room noise and all that. And I'm going to play this track for you. I'm going to let you hear it about 3 times, so just listen really closely. I'm going to scroll down here before I get started. I'm going to go to this analog emulation. I'm going to turn this on. You'll see when I turn it on. You can see that all these tracks have this automation that we talked about putting on there on each one of these tracks, so that you don't have any question about that when I do that. I just have the automation view turned off, because after I've gotten the automation on there and centered it, then I just add it from the wave file, so from the event itself. So basically we'll listen to that track. You know, it's just a real simple me singing something real simple through a fairly inexpensive microphone, and then I'll start adding noise into it so you can see how much I can actually get in there after the automation that you can't hardly even notice. And I can bring it down. I bring it down normally pretty low, but as you experiment, you might leave it up a little bit higher. Just remember, as you get more experience, you probably won't add as much. So it's kind of a simple concept. You'll have to bear with me 1 second, because I'm going to set up my process higher, because I'm getting spikes over here. So anyway, basically it's pretty simple concept. And how we're going to work this is, hello. Okay, so how we're going to do this is listen to this track 3 times, and then I'm going to start adding noise into it so you can hear it. First the analog, and then we'll do some sound sculpting on it. So I'm going to turn down my microphone, and then I will let you hear this and that few times, and then I will go to this and start blending it in. Really quickly, before we start the experiment, I wanted to show you something. I'm going to put on your headphones really quick so that you can kind of hear really carefully. And before we do the experiment, that the noise if you look at it here and you look at it here, that it's automated, right? So I want to let you hear it, what it sounds like without the actual audio it's going on, so you can have an understanding of how much is going on there. I've got it up pretty loud right now, and I'll bring it down slowly to about where it should be when we're doing the experiment in a moment. So I'm going to turn down my microphone and let you hear the actual levels of the noise that will be going on in the experiment, so you have some reference to what the noise by itself sounds like. Give me just a second. Now when I do the experiment, you will see me show you this analog warmth file, and then we'll do the sculpting file down below it, and then we'll do them together. And their levels will be approximately this at the end. So you got some kind of understanding with the automation going on of what the noise, how loud it is just by itself. So when we go through this experiment in a moment, that you got kind of an understanding of what the actual loudness of the noise is as we're adding it in there, and at the end when I've basically finished it to what I think for now, before I go through everything else, that it should be set at as the preliminary levels as I do my sculpting processing. So hold on just a minute and we'll get to the experiment. Do your magic, make me sound good. 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 Now, if you listen to that closely, basically what was happening there is you could hear the noise, the actual file itself, and then when I started adding noise into it, that you could hear when I turned it way up how audible it was, and as I started dropping it down, it's less and less audible. And I brought it down to one point, and let's sit there and I dropped it down even more because I know that I'm just analog warmth. Basically, the microphone was fairly inexpensive, and I basically had a pretty clean capture through my system. It's had a little bit, I've cleaned it up, so I've eradicated a lot of the noise from it. If you look at that file, that thing about filtering, the video we have on this segment about filtering your files before you start working on them, I filtered it really well. I did a little bit of EQ, and then I did a little bit of reverb, but it's still kind of dry. It's pretty dry for me cleaning it up really well. So I've added a little bit of that noise to try to help it not sound too hyper clean, because in some situations it might be okay, but in sometimes it's better to have a little bit in there, you know, depending on the production and depending where it's going to be sitting in the production. So I've added what I thought would be a good amount of analog warmth. Next, we're going to do the same thing again, or we're going to go into this sculpting file that's the brown, gray, blue mix. And I'm going to add those in there. Then what I'm going to do is combine this file and this file together, so you can kind of hear what it sounds like. But I'll go through the same process, letting you hear this alone a few times, and then I'll start adding this into it. And then once I get it set to where I think that that's about right, because I've already added analog warmth in there, but that I have turned off at the moment, then I'm going to mix them together. And I may bring both those files down and level a little bit. I might bring them up again and then bring them down together to see how it happens. So the end result is what we're looking for. Then I'll click them both off and let you hear the file with and without the work. It's very subtle work, so really keep that in mind. So it's a lot of experimentation on your part, and you may not see it quite the way that I see it and want to do it different. It's a very opinionated task. Plus, we're going to be doing saturation, distortion, possibly harmonic content, and readjusting EQ afterwards. So it's a pretty complicated, you know, process. But let's take a look at this and go run through that. Do your magic, make me sound good. 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 Okay, so basically what I have happening there is I've gotten it to where I'm pretty happy with this lower end noise file for sculpting to give it a little bit more warmth. The lower end noise, it's this brown, gray, and blue mixture. It's a really smooth noise. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to add these two with it. I'm going to highlight both these tracks, and I'm going to let you hear it with it and without it a couple times, and then I'm going to highlight both these tracks together, and I'm going to adjust it up and down again to let you. I'm going to bring it up with the both of them together. I'm going to bring them up so you can kind of hear what happens with a mixture of them. So let's listen to them with it or without it, with it and without it a couple times, and see what we got. Do your magic, make me sound good. 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 Okay, so first of all, what we want to see is that, you know, just the analog warmth added into it and then just the sound sculpting and the combination of them both. You have to keep in mind that I've cleaned this file up quite a bit and done a really good job. I tried to clean it up pretty good, but I was using an inexpensive microphone. I didn't want it to be, you know, like two radio captures so that those people that don't have really good rooms and stuff like that can understand. If you don't have all that stuff, you can clean up things pretty well. And after adding a little bit of EQ and reverberation to it, just so it didn't really dry, that I added that in there because if you listened to it before, by itself, it's a little bit dry. It's a little bit dry and a little harsh. That it's not, it's been cleaned up really well. It's been EQ'd a little bit, would help a little bit, and a little bit of reverberation helped it, but it's still pretty harsh. You know, it's not really, it doesn't have a lot of warmth to it, you know, and plus when I was listening to it, it could have used a little bit of noise in the lower end, you know, some lower end noise. This is my opinion. Yours might be different. So how you go to apply it where you think is really opinionated, but you can see when I made my decision that I wanted a little bit of analog warmth, but not too much, just kind of warm it up a little bit because it was a little dry and a little harsh, and I wanted to give it a little bit of warmth, so I added just a little bit in there. You got to keep in mind, I'm looking at this as an out front track. So it's going to be real audible, so I got to be real careful about having way too much audible noise happening, and I got to back way off. It will get some blending from the rest of the production and when I do my other work on it, but I got to kind of be careful of it. So you could hear that. Then I did a little bit of sound scoping because I want a little bit of lower end, you know, the noise, a little bit softer noise because my transducers sound a little bit harsh. And I thought, well, maybe a little bit of lower noise to give it a little more smoky feel. And so that was the route that I took. So you can see that the application, my opinion, of what I think it needed and what I decided to use and then how much of I decided to use of it, sometimes it's very subtle. And, you know, but it's not a hard process. You know, the biggest problem you're going to run into is how much. Okay, so you deciding how much of each one of those, which one of each one of those that you're going to add, and is the biggest issue. You forming a good opinion of that, knowing when you got too much or not enough, which noise files are really helping that vocal when you're sculpting, how much analog warmth it needs, and understanding it's going to blend with the rest of the mix. You working on that and experimenting is going to be way more important, because most of the time it's really subtle work. You can see how easy the work is. It's not that difficult. We went through the whole process there, basically. Now, when I go do my saturation, possibly some distortion, and maybe harmonic work and readjust the equalization again, then I may go back and readjust that. You know, I might go back and go, oh, well, now that's, I might want to add a little bit less noise, or I might want to add a little bit more. It's okay, because it's going to get evened out by the saturation and the work that I did, that 2 steps forward and 2 steps back. Because noise is one of the most subtle applications. It's normally, you know, one of the least audible, you know, processing sound sculpting, you know, tools that you use in sculpting processors is noise. So you really have to understand that you really just need to take your time at your application of it. But that's a very simple application of it. And I certainly hope you could hear that well enough so that when you go through this, and you start trying to apply that, the simple process it is, and it's more about you getting comfortable with your opinion of when to add analog warmth, how much analog warmth file that you're going to add in there, and you know, when you decide to do sculpting, what type of noise file are you going to use? Are you going to go in there also, and are you going to band pass it? Are you going to like get it out an equalizer and band pass the lower end or the upper end, or what? How are you going to do it? Or are you going to leave it across the full spectrum? Also, there's applications like this to where this one here, I'd have used that analog warmth, and then I went in there and sculpted the other upper end with this blue noise that's been bandpass filtered to the EQ just to be the upper end, and go down to the lower end I wanted to do with a different noise to help it in the lower end. Does that make sense? And the crossover point would be like this. So this is going down there, and the other one would be going across here, that you can see about where that is, where the crossover is right here and right there. So that's a little bit different application. You add one, then add the other one in there and start working it, you know, until you get it to where you're happy with it. But it's very subtle work. You know, a lot of times you're going to be using, you know, your earphones and really working on your critical listening, because it's very subtle. You know, I'll go through here again and we'll listen to it with it, without it, that I know what it's going to sound like later when I do all the rest of work to it, and I'm trying to see the future. So, you know, I got a pretty good idea what I'm trying to do. But you can listen, well, we already listened to it enough, I think, how subtle the work is. Now, you can add more as you get, you know, and then when you get into the mix, because you think it's not even worth the trouble, you might go ahead and add a little bit more if you want, and then just, you know, folder these together. Like if I got done with this work on this track, I'd highlight all these tracks, and then I'd put them into a pack folder or something like that, so that all 3 of those tracks are inside of this folder when I go to work on them. Does that make sense? So and then you can do your other rendering and stuff like that later. But it's very subtle. But sometimes you might want to go in there, add a little bit more, and then as you start to get farther and farther in your mix, go back and back off some. Say, okay, well, now that I've got it going in the mix, that's too much noise. Or after I've done some saturation and some distortion and some harmonic content or some EQ, it's too much noise, so I'll go back there and back off a little bit and then listen to it. That way, at least you're hearing it, you know. It's like, because a lot of these saturation noise things, especially, people start doing it and think, what is the point of that? I'm not hearing it. It's not that audible. But it's out of phase with the other noise on the file. It's out of phase with the saturation work you do. It'll be out of phase with distortion work you do. You adjust harmonic content, which is going to adjust all the rest of the harmonics. And then your re-equalizing it's going to have an effect to where it's going to change in the direction that you're shooting for. When you're trying to change the file, trying to get harsher or smoother or blend things out, or, you know, trying to affect what the transducer sounds like or the instrument sounds like with noise files, it really takes some experimentation. But the application is pretty simple, and you really need to experiment with it. Just keep in mind, go light. And when you first start out, you can add quite a bit more of analog emulation and sculpting. And, as you go forward in the process, you can always go back and back off some if you haven't rendered it onto the file and stuff like that. Like, rendering your convolution reverb onto your file, because it's just in the file next to it that's playing together that you have in a folder together. And you can go back and back off until you get comfortable. It takes a little bit of time, experimentation, and practice, but it's a pretty simple application. And you'd be surprised what a little bit of noise, how much it can help. Like my transducer, that it's got this lower end here, but it's a little gravelly, and it's like, a little bit of lower end noise is going to help even it out. So it really sounds good, like I'm like this cool R&B album, And something like that, band pass in the lower end, might help. And I might have to put a little bit of blue noise in the upper end, a little bit of analog warmth to kind of blend it out and blend it together, and give it a little bit more warmth. And you'd be surprised how much it can help by the time you get done going through the sculpting process, that how much it can actually affect after you get done practicing it and applying it and experimenting with it and seeing with it on there and without it after you go through the sculpting process. How much it can affect to make your whatever instrument sound or voice you're working on just sound really nice. So I hope that made it very simple. I hope this video was fairly simple for you to follow so that you can recreate this in your studio and begin experiment with it and understand. Just keep in mind how delicate the work can be, but you can go a little bit heavy. You can always, after you go along a little farther, you can come back and readjust and come down a little bit. But just remember, when you get done with all your processing, it will have affected, and sometimes drastically, to help, after you're really thinking about the transducer you're working on, what's it missing? But that takes experimentation and practice. So you adding different noises to some sound or vocal that you're working on to see how it's affecting it. So you can get used to the different effects of different noises. But that's a very simple application. Your automation is probably your biggest gun applying noise to any of your tracks, and it's very powerful. You'd be surprised once you get to be a next level master audio engineer, how sometimes a little bit of noise can just save a vocal or an instrument or how it sounds in some certain production, to give it some kind of texture or change its texture to complement what else is going on. It's a very powerful tool. So peace, hope, love. I certainly hope you enjoyed this video, and I'll see you in the next one.